There is a place on this earth that billions face in prayer every single day. A place so sacred that entire cities are built around protecting it. Yet, it carries a rule unlike any other holy site in the world. If you do not believe, you cannot enter. Some who tried paid the price. Others went to extreme lengths to get inside. But why? What is it about this place that makes it so forbidden and so protected? Most of you must have heard about the Kaaba and why it has been forbidden to some people. But what the Qur'an and Islamic scholars have hid from you is what you will find out in this video. Stay with us, because the answer will change how you see faith, history, and the unseen power behind the world's most mysterious sanctuary. Every Muslim, no matter where they live, turns toward this sanctuary in prayer. 5 times a day, millions bow in the same direction, unified by a single focal point. During Hajj, the largest gathering of humanity converges on this very site, circling the Kaaba in a ritual that traces back to the time of Prophet Ibrahim. For Muslims, the Kaaba is not just a structure. It is the house of God on earth, a symbol of devotion, humility, and unity under the oneness of Allah. Yet, this sanctuary is not open to everyone. There is a boundary drawn around it, an invisible line that separates those who believe from those who do not. For non-believers, entry into this sacred zone is forbidden. Why? What makes this single structure in Makkah so exclusive, so protected, that only those who accept the faith of Islam are allowed to approach? The answer cannot be understood by looking at the Kaaba only as stone and mortar. To grasp the depth of this restriction, one must journey back into history, to the time when the Kaaba's story began. According to Islamic tradition, its foundation was laid not by kings or tribal leaders, but by the prophets themselves. Ibrahim and his son Ismail rebuilt it on ancient foundations, dedicating it solely to the worship of one God. They prayed that it would remain a beacon of monotheism, a pure sanctuary for all who submitted to Allah. But as centuries passed, that purity was lost. The Kaaba became surrounded by idols, its original message overshadowed by rituals that no longer reflected its divine purpose. Pagan tribes made it their center of worship, bringing offerings to stones and statues placed inside the very sanctuary built to honor the Creator. The site was open to all, but it no longer stood for the faith that Ibrahim had established. When Prophet Muhammad emerged with the message of Islam, he found the Kaaba at the heart of this corrupted tradition. The very house that was meant for the worship of Allah alone had become a house of many gods. Non-believers, merchants, and tribal leaders treated it as a shrine of power and commerce rather than a place of submission. For Muslims, this was not only heartbreaking but a distortion of sacred history. The transformation began when the Prophet and his followers finally reclaimed Makkah. The idols were removed, the Kaaba was purified, and its original purpose was restored. From that moment, it stood again as the sanctuary of monotheism, a house only for those who acknowledged the oneness of God. The Qur'an then made the restriction clear. Non-believers were no longer permitted to approach Masjid al-Haram. The sanctuary was not meant to be a tourist attraction or a marketplace of faiths. It was to be preserved solely as the heart of Islamic worship. This restriction raises questions that stir both curiosity and controversy. Why such exclusivity? Why does the Kaaba, a site of universal fascination, remain closed to outsiders? The answer lies in what it represents. To Muslims, the Kaaba is not a relic of history or an artifact of culture. It is a living sanctuary, inseparable from the act of worship itself. It is the Qibla, the direction of prayer, and the central symbol of surrender to Allah. Allowing entry to those who reject its very meaning would dilute its sanctity and distort its purpose. Think of it this way. Every religion protects its holiest spaces. Some temples allow only the initiated inside. Certain shrines restrict access to preserve their sacredness. The Kaaba is no different, except that its role is far greater. It is not one holy site among many. It is the heart of an entire faith, the focal point of 1 billion prayers each day. Its preservation as a sanctuary for believers is not about exclusion, but about protecting a covenant that stretches back to the dawn of humanity. This is the mystery we seek to uncover. What really happened to non-believers who once walked its courtyard? Why did Islam draw a line around this house after centuries of open access? And how has that restriction shaped the Kaaba's role in the world today? The answers unfold through history, from the days when the Kaaba was filled with idols, to the moment it was purified by Prophet Muhammad, to the modern rules that guard its sanctity. Each chapter reveals not just what happened to outsiders, but why this sanctuary remains, to this day, a place only for those who believe. The Kaaba's history begins with its construction by the Prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail, peace be upon them both. According to Islamic tradition, Allah commanded Ibrahim to build a sanctuary on earth, a house that would symbolize monotheism and serve as a place where humanity could turn to him in worship. The Qur'an records this moment and mention when Ibrahim was raising the foundations of the house and Ismail, saying, "Our Lord, accept this from us. Indeed, you are the hearing, the knowing." Quran 2, 127. The Kaaba they built was simple in design. It had no ornate decorations, no images, and no idols. It was not meant to glorify human power or wealth, but to stand as a sign of devotion to Allah alone. Its purpose was clear: to establish a permanent center of worship for Tawheed, the belief in the absolute oneness of God. Ibrahim was also commanded to proclaim pilgrimage, calling people from every corner of the earth to visit this house in worship. From its very beginning, the Kaaba was meant to unite humanity in devotion to one Creator. Over time, however, this pure foundation was corrupted. After the passing of Ibrahim and Ismail, generations later, Arabian society drifted away from monotheism. Idolatry spread across the region. Instead of worshiping Allah alone, tribes introduced local gods, spirits, and deities. Gradually, these false gods found their way into the Kaaba itself. What was built as a sanctuary of pure faith became filled with idols. By the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the Kaaba housed 360 idols, one for each day of the lunar year. Each tribe in Arabia had placed its own idol inside or around the sanctuary. The Quraysh, the tribe that controlled Makkah, took pride in this arrangement because it turned the Kaaba into a center of commerce and religious tourism. Pilgrims from across the Arabian Peninsula would visit Makkah to honor their tribal gods, bringing wealth to the Quraysh. Among the idols was Hubal, considered one of the greatest idols of Quraysh. Statues representing Allat, Al, Uzza, and Manat, revered female deities, also stood near the Kaaba. Some idols were made of wood, others of stone or precious metals. Some tribes brought even smaller idols with them during pilgrimage and took them back afterward. The sanctuary was transformed into a house of polytheism, far removed from its original purpose. Alongside the idols, pagan rituals took root. Circumambulation of the Kaaba, which Ibrahim and his descendants had performed as an act of worship to Allah, was continued, but in corrupted forms. Some people performed tawaf naked, arguing that they could not circle the Kaaba in clothes that had been worn in sin. Others called upon their idols during the rites, believing the statues could intercede with Allah. Sacrifices were made in the name of false gods, and divination through arrows was practiced near the sanctuary. What had once been pure worship became a blend of superstition, idolatry, and tribal pride. Despite this corruption, the Kaaba retained its position as the central religious site of Arabia. Its importance never faded. Every tribe in the peninsula respected its sanctity, even if they disagreed in other matters. Makkah was recognized as a sacred territory, where fighting was forbidden. During the months of pilgrimage, even tribes at war laid down their arms to journey to the Kaaba. This universal respect made it not only a religious center, but also a hub of trade and diplomacy. Because of this, the Kaaba before Islam was open to all. Believers, non-believers, idol worshippers, and travelers from distant lands could all visit it. For some, it was a place of genuine devotion to Allah, though mixed with pagan practices. For others, it was merely a cultural or commercial opportunity. The Quraysh encouraged this openness because it strengthened their position as guardians of the Kaaba and brought economic benefit to their city. The openness of the Kaaba in this era is important to note. Non-believers did not face restrictions. In fact, they dominated the sanctuary. They controlled access, decided rituals, and defined its role in society. The Kaaba was no longer functioning as the house of Allah, but as a house of many gods. This situation continued for centuries, with generations growing up knowing only a Kaaba filled with idols, rather than the original Kaaba of Ibrahim, built for the worship of the one God. Even so, remnants of the Kaaba's original legacy survived. Many Arabs acknowledged Allah as a supreme deity above their idols, but claimed they needed intermediaries, statues, and spirits to reach him. They still honored some traditions passed down from Ibrahim, such as pilgrimage and sacrifice, but their meanings had been distorted. The core of Tawhid had been lost, even as the outward rituals remained. By the 6th century CE, on the eve of Islam, the Kaaba stood as both a unifying and corrupt institution. It united the tribes of Arabia in common rituals, yet it represented a distortion of its divine purpose. It was respected as a sacred sanctuary, yet it was filled with false gods. It was the most important religious site in Arabia, yet it no longer reflected the truth of monotheism. This was the Kaaba before Islam, a house once built for Allah alone, now dominated by idols. A sanctuary once intended for pure worship, now open to all believers and non-believers alike. Its history had strayed far from its origins, and it was waiting for restoration. That restoration would come with the mission of Prophet Muhammad, who would return the Kaaba to its true role as the center of faith in the one true God. In the 7th century, the Kaaba stood at the heart of Makkah, under the control of the Quraysh tribe. As guardians of the sanctuary, the Quraysh enjoyed both religious prestige and economic power. Pilgrims from across Arabia visited the Kaaba to worship their idols, and this brought trade and wealth to the city. For the Quraysh, the Kaaba was not only a religious site, but also the foundation of their influence. When Prophet Muhammad began preaching the message of Islam, the worship of Allah alone, and the rejection of idols, the Quraysh saw it as a direct threat. His call challenged the very system that gave them authority. If the Kaaba was restored to its original role as a house of monotheism, the idols would be removed, and the Quraysh would lose their control over the flow of pilgrims and the economy attached to it. For this reason, they fiercely resisted the Prophet's mission. Muslims were persecuted, mocked, and in many cases forced to leave Makkah. Access to the Kaaba was denied, and the believers could not worship freely at the sanctuary built for the one God. Despite this opposition, Islam grew. After years of hardship in Makkah, the Prophet and his followers migrated to Medina in 622 CE. From there, Islam established itself as a community with both spiritual and political strength. But the Kaaba remained under Quraysh control, filled with idols and guarded against Muslims. A turning point came in 628 CE with the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Prophet and his companions set out from Medina to perform Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage. However, the Quraysh blocked them from entering Makkah. After tense negotiations, an agreement was signed. The Muslims would not enter the city that year, but they would be allowed to return the following year for 3 days to perform their rituals. The treaty was seen by some companions as humiliating, but it proved to be a strategic victory. It gave Islam recognition as a legitimate community and opened the door to peaceful interaction between Muslims and Quraysh. For the first time, Muslims were formally granted access to the Kaaba, even if only for a limited time. Within 2 years, the treaty was broken when Quraysh allies attacked a Muslim-aligned tribe. This violation led to a decisive moment in 630 CE, the conquest of Makkah. The Prophet advanced with an army of 10,000, entering the city with minimal bloodshed. The Quraysh, unable to resist, surrendered. The first action of the Prophet upon entering the Kaaba was to purify it. The idols that filled the sanctuary, 360 in number, were destroyed. The Kaaba was restored to its original state as a house of monotheism, dedicated to Allah alone. The Prophet declared Makkah a sanctuary, where fighting and idol worship would never again be permitted. From that moment, the Kaaba no longer belonged to the Quraysh as a tribal shrine. It was reclaimed as the universal house of worship for all Muslims. What Ibrahim and Ismail had built was revived, and the Kaaba stood once again as the center of Tawheed, free from idols and no longer under the control of those who rejected the truth. With the conquest of Makkah in 630 CE, the Kaaba was finally restored to its original purpose as a house of worship dedicated only to Allah. The idols were destroyed, the sanctuary was purified, and the people of Makkah embraced Islam in large numbers. Yet one issue remained: the presence of non-believers in the sacred mosque. For centuries, the Kaaba had been open to all idol worshippers, merchants, and travelers. The conquest had ended Quraysh control, but the question of access to the sanctuary was not yet settled. The final ruling came in the Qur'an. In the 9th year after the Hijrah, the command was revealed in Surah At-Tawbah. O you who believe, indeed the polytheists are impure, so let them not approach al-Masjid al-Haram after this, their final year. Quran 9:28. This verse established a clear boundary. Non-believers, particularly idol worshippers, were no longer allowed to enter the sacred mosque or approach the Kaaba. The timing of this revelation was significant. By this point, Islam had spread across Arabia, and the Kaaba had once again become the central focus of pilgrimage, but this time in its true form, free from idols. Allowing idolaters to continue entering the sanctuary would undermine the very purpose of its purification. The Kaaba was not meant to be a shared shrine for many gods. It was meant to be the house of Allah alone. The prohibition ensured that its sanctity would be preserved for generations to come. The implementation of this rule was direct and practical. During the Hajj of that year, the Prophet sent Ali ibn Abi Talib to publicly announce that no idol worshipper would be allowed to perform pilgrimage after that year, and that the Kaaba was reserved exclusively for those who submitted to Allah. The message was clear and final. The sanctuary of Makkah was no longer open to non-believers. This ruling also carried social and economic implications. For the Quraysh and other tribes, the Kaaba had long been a source of income. Pagan pilgrims brought trade and wealth to Makkah. Some feared that banning them would harm the economy, but the Quran addressed this concern directly in the same verse, promising that Allah would enrich the believers from His bounty. Within a short time, this promise was fulfilled, as Islam expanded and new sources of prosperity reached Makkah. The prohibition was not a form of punishment against outsiders but a protection of sanctity. The Kaaba symbolized pure monotheism, and its role as the Qibla, the direction of prayer, made it central to Islamic life. Allowing those who rejected its meaning to continue entering would have diluted its role and blurred the line between truth and falsehood. The prohibition made it clear: this house belonged only to Allah and to those who believed in Him. From that year onward, the rule was enforced consistently. Non-believers, whether idol worshippers or others who rejected Islam, could not enter the haram. The Kaaba was no longer a place where anyone could impose their own practices. It had become the universal sanctuary of Islam, set apart and preserved for believers alone. This restriction remains in place to this day. In modern Saudi Arabia, the boundary of Makkah is guarded, and non-Muslims are not permitted to cross it. Signs on highways direct non-Muslims away from the haram area. Checkpoints ensure that the Quranic command is respected. Those who attempt to enter are simply turned back. The enforcement is firm but not violent. It is a continuation of the principle established nearly 14 centuries ago. The Quranic prohibition transformed the Kaaba's role in history. It ended centuries of idolatrous access and secured its place as the eternal heart of Islamic worship. What had once been a shrine open to all, dominated by idols and pagan rituals, was now a sanctuary preserved for the worship of Allah alone. For Muslims, this was not exclusion but restoration, the fulfillment of the prayer of Ibrahim and Ismail when they raised its foundations, that it would remain a place of guidance for the faithful. After the Quranic prohibition in the year 631 CE, the rule excluding non-believers from entering Masjid al-Haram and approaching the Kaaba became an established part of Islamic practice. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made it clear that the Kaaba was now a sanctuary reserved solely for those who believed in Allah. His companions and the early Muslim community implemented this directive with consistency, ensuring that the sacred house remained protected from idolatry and misuse. Throughout the centuries that followed, Islamic rulers upheld this restriction. The rightly guided caliphs, who succeeded the Prophet, continued to enforce the prohibition as part of their duty to protect the sanctity of the harem. For them, the Kaaba was not simply a symbol of faith, but the physical and spiritual heart of the Muslim Ummah. To compromise its sanctity by allowing idol worshippers or non-believers inside would have been seen as violating a divine command. As the Islamic Empire expanded beyond Arabia into regions such as Persia, the Levant, North Africa, and later Spain, the Kaaba remained a focal point of unity. Muslims from newly converted lands journeyed to Makkah for pilgrimage, but non-believers were excluded. The prohibition was not a temporary measure, but a lasting principle that preserved the uniqueness of the Kaaba as the house of monotheism. Enforcement of the rule varied in its method, but not in its principle. At times when Makkah was under threat from external powers, Muslim rulers took extra precautions to secure the sanctuary. For example, during the Crusades in the 12th century, when Christian armies occupied Jerusalem and threatened the holy sites of Islam, access to Makkah was closely guarded. Non-Muslims were barred from approaching, and the sacred boundaries were monitored to ensure that only believers entered. There were rare instances in history when outsiders attempted to disguise themselves to gain access. A few non-Muslim travelers, often historians or explorers, entered Mecca secretly, sometimes even adopting Muslim identities to avoid detection. Some succeeded and later wrote accounts of what they saw. Others were caught and expelled. In either case, their presence highlighted the seriousness with which Muslims guarded the Kaaba from unauthorized entry. The prohibition was not a symbolic rule, but an actively enforced boundary. The restriction also became part of the broader understanding of Mecca as a sanctuary. The entire Haram area, not just the Kaaba, was considered sacred. Fighting was forbidden within it. Hunting animals was prohibited, and even uprooting plants was not allowed. These laws underscored that Mecca was unlike any other place on earth. And central to this uniqueness was the principle that only believers had the right to enter and worship there. In the modern era, enforcement has become more systematic. In Saudi Arabia today, the boundary of Mecca is marked by checkpoints. Highways leading into the city are divided, with clear signs indicating separate routes for Muslims and non-Muslims. Security officials ensure that the Quranic command is upheld. Those who are not Muslim are redirected away from the Haram area. The policy is firm but non-confrontational. Non-Muslims are not punished, but simply turned back at the boundary. This enforcement is supported not only by religious conviction but also by state law. Saudi Arabia's regulations are rooted in the Qur'an and Sunnah, and guarding the sanctity of the holy sites is considered a national responsibility. The government invests heavily in protecting the Haram, maintaining its facilities, and ensuring that the millions of pilgrims who enter every year can worship in safety and purity. For Muslims, this continued enforcement is not viewed as exclusionary, but as necessary. The Kaaba is not a cultural landmark or a historical artifact to be visited out of curiosity. It is a living house of worship, central to the faith and identity of Islam. Allowing those who do not share that faith to enter would undermine its role and disrespect its sanctity. The prohibition, therefore, is seen as an act of preservation rather than rejection. Over nearly 14 centuries, this rule has remained in place despite the rise and fall of empires, changes in political power, and transformations in global history. The Kaaba has remained constant as a sanctuary protected by faith. From the first proclamation in Qur'an 9:28 to the guarded highways of modern Mecca, the message has not changed. The Kaaba belongs to Allah, and it is reserved only for those who believe in Him. Although the Quranic prohibition was clear and consistently enforced by Muslim authorities, history records several daring attempts by non-Muslims to enter Mecca and see the Kaaba. For outsiders, the mystery surrounding the sacred sanctuary was irresistible. The Kaaba was known across the world as the holiest site in Islam, but because non-believers were forbidden to enter, it became a subject of curiosity, fascination, and sometimes even obsession. Over the centuries, a handful of explorers and travelers disguised themselves as Muslims to slip past the restrictions. Their stories add an unusual chapter to the Kaaba's history, one filled with drama, risk, and mixed outcomes. One of the earliest documented attempts came during the Abbasid period, when non-Muslim merchants from distant lands tried to accompany caravans into Mecca. Some were discovered and expelled immediately, while others were executed when their deception was uncovered. These rare cases reinforced to outsiders how seriously Muslims guarded the sanctity of their holy site. In later centuries, particularly during the age of European exploration, several travelers became famous for their secret journeys into Mecca. The most well-known was Ludovico di Vartema, an Italian adventurer of the early 16th century. Disguising himself as a Muslim from Damascus, he managed to enter Mecca and perform the rites of pilgrimage. His descriptions of the Kaaba later reached Europe, making him one of the first non-Muslims in the West to write about it. Though his account was filled with exaggerations, it captured the imagination of Europeans who had never seen or heard detailed reports of Islam's holiest sanctuary. Another famous example was Sir Richard Francis Burton, a British explorer in the 19th century. Fluent in Arabic and skilled in local customs, Burton disguised himself as an Afghan Muslim doctor. In 1853, he successfully infiltrated Mecca, entered Masjid al-Haram, and even touched the Black Stone. He later published his experiences in his book, Personal Narrative of a Pilgrimage to Al-Madinah and Mecca. Burton's account was highly detailed, carefully written to avoid offending Muslims while still satisfying European curiosity. His success, however, also highlighted the risks. Had he been discovered, he likely would have been executed. Not all attempts ended so dramatically. Some non-Muslim travelers were caught early and expelled before reaching the Kaaba. Others turned back voluntarily when they realized the danger of their mission. These outcomes varied, but one fact remained consistent: the prohibition was enforced. Non-believers who were discovered faced immediate consequences, and the sanctity of the Kaaba was preserved. The stories of these disguised travelers add an element of suspense to history. They reveal how determined some outsiders were to see what was forbidden to them, and how far they were willing to go, even risking their lives to enter the sacred city. For Muslims, however, these attempts were not viewed with admiration but with disapproval.